So now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our main speaker for tonight. Samuel Singer is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at Thompson University and a longtime advocate for trans people. In 2017, he completed a comprehensive report for the Canadian Human Rights Commission on the development of trans rights in Canada. I've seen this report, it is excellent. He founded the Trans Legal Clinic in Montreal in 2014 and served as its supervising lawyer. Before his legal studies, he worked for ASTT, a Quebec trans health and advocacy project. Now, he has asked me to introduce him in the following way, and in a moment you will see why. He will speak to you tonight about tax law and how it intersects with trans law. Please help me in welcoming Samuel Singer.
So it's really quite an honor to be here. I've followed the trans archives and the trans chair for a long time. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I was so excited when it was first started. And then I kind of can't believe that I'm lucky enough to be here. This is only my second time in Victoria, and I'm really honored to be speaking amongst you. I also was touched when they told me that it was going to be in line with the scholarship and fundraising night. They were going to launch their campaign. That's actually really important to me. I never thought it would be important to me. I actually thought, that scholarship and fundraising was something that someone else does. But then I got older and I became a law prof, which was something that I never expected. In fact, I'd never imagined a portion of my life, I'm turning 40 this year, I never imagined a portion of my life that consisted of post-35. That wasn't really in the options. And so now here I am, I'm a law prof, I strangely teach tax law, which is my other passion. I do things that start with the letter T. And I'm in a position where I can fundraise, and I'm pretty committed to doing so. And I had a lot of funding that got me through law school, funding that got me through graduate school, people who believed in me and gave me funding, and it wouldn't have been possible without it, and not only financially, but also it made me think that maybe I had something to contribute and that it was valuable. Funding begets funding, right? Like I started to put stuff on my CV and somebody recognized who I was and that I had something valuable to contribute, and then the world started to believe that that was true. I'm still wondering if they're correct, but it was very, very, very valuable for me. And so when I heard that, they do give me an honorarium as a Lansdowne lecturer as part of that series, and so I'll donate that back. That's $500 that I'll donate back. And what I did is I called my mom and I said, I'm going to trans chair study, my poor mom. And I said, will you match my donation? And she will, so she has. And I just would encourage you, so yeah, I'm turning 40, and I never thought that I would do that thing with my parents, but it's like, I think we should do it. I think it's time to turn around to, you may not be in a position where your family can do that or where you can do that, but I have started to get to the point where I'm trying, and I think you should think about whether you can do so as well. So I do the harder, like Aaron does the softer sell, I do the harder sell. Call your parents. We all, hopefully, will ultimately be in a position where we can contribute either through our hours or through dollars, and I can't tell you how much of a difference it makes, and I think we already heard from Leo how much a difference it made in his life. Leo unfortunately went before me and summarized everything in 3 minutes, and obviously should have won first place. I don't know what happened there, but should have been. So I'll do the 45-minute version, and I apologize in advance. I'm going to talk about trans rights. I've been doing this research for a while about the evolution of trans rights in Canada. Can everyone hear me? I told them not to mic me because my students say I scream. So, apologize. So let me know if there's any trouble, and Michael will hook it up. I'm going to talk about trans rights, but I want to talk about how trans rights are not only human rights. I think we've heard a lot in the news recently about trans rights, it's human rights, these new amendments that are going to change everything. Perhaps some people think we're done now, and I just really want to highlight from my research about the evolution of trans rights in Canada how much of the work around trans rights happens outside of human rights law, and why we need to count both human rights and other areas of law as our priority. All right, so I'll work my way through this. I always like to put an agenda first because then I can make a joke about how I have a hidden agenda. a hidden agenda is actually quite obvious, which is that I want to center trans people. And I really believe that our work around trans rights should come from what trans people tell us that they need from the legal system, and what the case law tells us that trans people have needed from the legal system. And I'm fortunate because the legal needs assessment just came out of Toronto, where they interviewed a lot of trans people in Ontario, and they identified very clearly their interactions with the legal system. That's the HALCO needs assessment. And then from my own research for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, I read basically all the case law about trans people in Canada. It was a bit of a bigger project than I originally anticipated. And I just saw how, from that case law, that there was a misunderstanding about what the priorities were, that there were so many trans legal issues happening in family law, in poverty law, and not only in human rights. And so I propose that we resituate our understanding of trans rights to take leadership from trans people and from trans case law. Okay? And I'm not saying we haven't done that with human rights. I think those human rights amendments have been very important. But I'm concerned about the risk of leaving out other areas of law. Why do I have this poster? So before I became a law prof, and before I was a practicing lawyer, and even before I went to law school, I worked for an outreach project called ASTT, Action Santé Travestis et Transsexuels de Quebec, which is the trans health project in Quebec. And I worked as an outreach worker. I was in bars and in trans bars, and I ran a drop-in group that was founded, ASTT was founded by Viviane Namaste, and it's one of the oldest running trans groups. And we decided to make some pamphlets. At that time, it was 2005, and there was no information really available about access to hormones, what hormones did, and what your options were for transitioning. And so we decided, we got some money from hepatitis C funding, which if any of you are familiar with the history of funding, that was the only envelope that would give us money. So we said, Nick, no problem, absolutely, we'll make the links between hormones and liver health. Injections, liver health, and so we did, and we got this funding, and we said we've got to really take advantage. And so what we did is we used superheroes. And it was, at the time, there was very little portrayal of trans people in a positive way. It was all trans people. Basically, you could never watch a movie where a trans person survived, right? Which is something that we see also in gay, in the trajectory of gay representation, and a lot of other marginalized people. And we thought we're going to actually make images that are positive of trans people and center them as the heroes of their own stories. And awkwardly, I am pictured there with the red baseball cap. And my partner frequently is like, what happened? You used to be so cool. But yeah, no, I am there. And so that's part of what always guides me when I do this work, is I think I want to make sure that we think of, like, who are the trans people? How are they the heroes of their own story, and what are they telling us, okay? So I'm trying to take leadership from trans people. Instead of, you'll find that I have a very pragmatic approach. I worked in communities and in community legal clinics. I worked as a lawyer, and so I'm not so good at that theoretical stuff. I'm more interested in how we directly respond to the needs of trans people. So I like to use the word pragmatic. I propose a pragmatic approach where we just say, like, what do trans people need? What do they tell us that they need? All right, I don't want to create a new theory of trans rights. I want it to be based on trans people's actual experiences with the law. May not make me a leading legal theorist in the area, but pragmatic. And so I thought that would be a good time actually to sort of just take this tie off. And let's get a little bit more pragmatic. We can have a little bit more of a casual conversation. I'm the only one on this campus wearing a tie, so it's I'm still adjusting to West Coast living. I'm originally from Montreal. Okay, so we're going to take a pragmatic approach, and we're going to look at the other areas of law that trans people intersect with, right? So we see that there's family law issues. Family law issues are not generally in human rights. Can I just see, like, how many of you are law types here? It's okay, there's no shame. law types? So like 2 or 3? Okay. And how many of you kind of hate the law? And how many want to talk about tax now? Okay, so I will make sure to be as accessible as possible, and if you don't understand something, throw something at me and I'll try again. Okay? So family law does not necessarily fall under human rights. Youth protection law, where people are interacting with the system because they're having some trouble with their families, doesn't usually fall under human rights. Criminal law, you can bring human rights issues in, but it's also a large extent outside. Immigration law, some human rights, but we see a lot of immigration law that's outside. And disability law, what I'm talking about is when you apply for access to disability benefits. Okay? So these are some of the areas of law. And there's this recent study that came out from Ontario that tracked the different types of legal needs that trans people have. And we see the big one over there. My partner told me to do this because she said most people are visual, but I'm not. So it's a bit awkward. But the big one is discrimination. Okay, then we next have medical, employment, housing. Personal injury is in there, debt. Over here we have immigration. And you see they're comparing to the Canadian population. Okay, and this is not what popular media has told us, right? What we've been hearing all in the public recently is all about human rights. We need to amend these Human Rights Acts and add gender identity and gender expression, and that will fix everything and protect trans people across Canada. So the errors in that is, first of all, there's a jurisdictional error, which I'll spare you, which is that those particular acts don't actually apply in a lot of legal areas. Like the federal act only applies to what's called federally regulated industries, so banking and the post office and the federal government. So we have to talk about amendments to provincial acts in order to even have that conversation. But there's also areas, because it's leaving out the reality of trans lives, so it's more of a symbolic victory. Here, I'm going to show you this one because I actually understand it more. And this lays out what trans people said their priorities and their legal issues were. Okay, and you'll see that discrimination is down there at 43% versus 5.3% for the general population. But there are a number of other areas that are actually outside of human rights. Today, I'm going to focus on disability benefits, employment, family law, and discrimination. Okay? Let me tell you a little bit about trans human rights because it's confusing to people. Trans people were protected. They've been protected for a long time under human rights ground. This is not a new development. They were quite protected since 1998 under the grounds of sex. Disability, when invoked, some controversy of whether or not people wanted to use disability, whether trans people wanted to use disability, but nonetheless, recognized protection in law, a significant amount of case law that said trans people are protected, their human rights are protected. Okay, in Quebec, all the way back to 1982, because Quebec's cool, they had a ground called civil status, right? I'm proud, what can I say? Okay? And then between 2002 and 2017, there's been a wave of adding gender identity, and sometimes gender expression as well, to these different human rights acts. Never to the Canadian Charter, okay, but to these provincial human rights acts that protect things like people from discrimination in employment, in services, in access to housing. And so they've been added, starting in 2002 all the way to 2017. I like to put 2002 up, that was Northwest Territories, right? So remember with the public debates that we had about this and whether it was going to, like, the world was going to collapse? And, well, I mean, it hasn't since 2002, right? Things have been pretty okay. So this is a pretty nice long stretch, 15 years, that we've been adding gender identity and in some cases gender expression as well in order to bolster the protection of trans people who were already protected under human rights, but for symbolic reasons and to make it more explicit. That's what you've been hearing about in the news. And human rights have done a lot. The human rights codes and provisions have been used to get some pretty significant victories. We have a nice amount of case law about protection from discrimination in employment. You can't fire a trans person because they're trans. You can't force a trans person to use a locker room that does not go with their gender identity. Huge victory in Canada around access to identity papers. Starting in 2012, going forward, we said you cannot require surgery in order to change your identity paper, something that many of us never thought was possible. Okay, huge victory that's really opened up Ontario, Alberta, and then a wave of change across Canada, and now pretty much everywhere in Canada, you cannot require surgery. So that's a human rights victory, okay? The idea that you need to respect someone's name and gender, a human rights victory. Changes and corrections that you're starting to hear about, where people are in prison, where they're placed, also human rights. Okay, so I don't want to take away from those major victories, but we do have a lot of people who have told us, you got to be careful about human rights. You got to be careful about the limitations and how it narrows your lens into the individual people that human rights protects and ignores the systemic issues. Okay, so we have Viviane Namaste, who actually founded the organization that I worked for before I went to law school, but who's now a very well-respected scholar. She said it's a neoliberal construct. It focuses too much on the individual. It ignores the fact that trans people are over-criminalized. It ignores issues like the decriminalization of sex work. It doesn't deal with racism. It's too much of an individual-based system. Okay? Dan Irving, another legal scholar, said, listen, that's not going to fix, that doesn't give us what we need for social justice. We know that there's racism, we know that there's a lot of poverty for trans people, and human rights you don't win a human rights case and get a huge check that then pays your way out of poverty. So then we, so what's the problem? Anti-discrimination law is super limited. It doesn't address systemic issues, but it's a valuable symbol. Perhaps you celebrated when we added the amendments. It's hard not to when people fought publicly against them. It's meaningful to have trans people explicitly recognized. I was invited to the flag raising ceremony. I wasn't able to attend, but I watched it and I cried. I mean, I thought it was really super meaningful. I thought that we needed to pass it once I heard people in Parliament speaking out against trans rights, right? Symbolic value. Also, and Aaron and I were discussing this earlier, lots of actions have been taken because of human rights amendments. Lots of federal government bodies have been like, trans people, they definitely have rights. It's time for us to reevaluate. Okay, so lots of steps taken to increase access to passports, to change corrections policies, to think about the immigration system, to change forms so that you can opt into a chosen gender. So good things. We also know that law reform is far from perfect. In fact, if we look at the history of law reform around LGBT issues, every wave of law reform, every time there's been legal changes, some people have been left out. There's always people left out. Okay? We always have to leave people behind. Same-sex marriage was a priority for many, left many trans people behind. Okay? Access to identity papers, a victory for many, left trans minors behind in a lot of provinces. Trans minors were not able to change their identity papers. Changing identity papers left non-binary people behind, right? People who are not able to eliminate the listing of male or female, or to have another option, okay? In Quebec, access to identity papers, huge victories. I ran these trans legal clinics where 60 people would come out. I called them massive sex change parties, because once the law changed, we'd come and everyone would fill out their forms to get their sex changed, right? And every time I had one of those, I had to explain to some people, well, I'm sorry, not you. You're not a Canadian citizen. We've left you behind. You're a minor, and until you're 18, we've left you behind. So we always know that there's compromises, and in the light of those compromises, we need to have a diverse toolkit ready to help us fight the good fight. Also, I don't know if you've noticed, and I'm a little bit nervous about this, but we might be in a time of backlash. And in a time of backlash, we got to be ready with all the tools, all the legal tools we can possibly have to fight back. And they're not only going to be in human rights. Okay? So, Brenda Kosman and Ida Oketri, they say, okay, like, great, we passed Bill C-16. We've recognized gender identity and gender expression, gender identity across the country. But now it's time to do the real work. Now we got to be ready to get out there and focus on substantive, systemic change. Figure out all the different needs that trans people have after the amendments. And so my proposal, which I think is theirs too, and probably many of you, is, all right, let's get to work. Let's do it. All right, here we are. We spent 2002 to 2017 really focused on that one. And now let's continue the work in the other areas of law. And how do we do that? Well, we look to see what trans people identify as their legal needs. And we're lucky to have that study that tells us very clearly what trans people's legal needs are, and there's more and more data coming out. We think about who's left behind by trans law reform. There's always people, every single wave. People are left behind. Family law now, seeing a lot of issues around trans parents, gender creative kids. Okay, and we think about what other legal tools we have where human rights can't help. So I take us back to this slide now from the beginning and remind us disability benefits, employment, family law, discrimination. Okay, those are the areas that I'm going to focus on today, although there are many others. What I want to do is, as I was doing this case law research, I realized that there are all these trans heroes. There are all these people going way back who had fought for their rights and not always in human rights law. And I feel that the Trans Archives tries hard to do this work, but we sometimes forget our heroes. And also, case law is often anonymized, so we don't know who people are. I personally am involved in a case right now. You should know this, full disclosure. I personally, not as a lawyer, but as a co-plaintiff, I'm involved in a case where I'm suing the Quebec government. Amongst others, it's a bit awkward, there's a lot of problems. Amongst other co-plaintiffs around how I'm listed on my kid's birth certificate. Okay? And we're also trying to change the rule that says that in Quebec, trans people who don't have Canadian citizenship cannot change their name or sex. So trans migrants, people, many of whom came here as refugees, and were accepted as refugees on the basis of the discrimination they face in their country of origin. So if you're trans, you face persecution, we accept you here. Have to wait 7 years in Quebec to change their name and sex, even though they've been accepted as refugees. So they can't live and benefit from the protection of Canada fully. Okay? So we're trying to change that. We're trying to change access for youth. We're trying to address issues around non-binary people and whether they're forced to list a sex at all on a birth certificate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we want to think about who's left out, and we want to think about the people who have done the work, because there's always people who have done this work before us. Okay? My first reason I came to this work was because of this case I read about in 1988. That was when I was 9. I was born in 1979. I'm turning 40 on February 18th. I know. A thing I never imagined possible. So I read about this case from 1988, and this case was about a trans dad who had a kid, and on that kid's birth certificate, he was listed as a mother. And he went to the court, and he said, he was a single parent, and he said, all right, fine, there's no way for me to change from being, to correct the birth certificate such that I become the father instead of the mother. I have an idea. And it said, I apply to adopt my own child. And I consent as the mother, and I adopt as the father. And the court said, I mean, there's nothing we can do about this. You're absolutely right. You can adopt your own child, you're consenting. And so it was that legally mother became a father and had his relationship to his child recognized in 1988, not with human rights law. Okay? Creative use of family law. Obviously doesn't work in a lot of contexts. Single parent required, and unfortunately, 16 years later, someone tried to do something similar, and the court said no. The court said, sorry, once a mother, always a mother. Once a father, always a father. Okay, and this is one of the issues that we're challenging right now. You have to, once a mother, always a mother. Once a father, always a father. And you have to be a mother or a father. There's no ability to be a parent. I always joke about this. Is anyone here born in BC? Oh, wow. A lot of you. Does your birth certificates, I believe, now say parent, parent? Has there been a revolution in the streets? So I always think it's very interesting, but in Quebec they're very concerned with mother and father, and parent, parent is not an option. Okay, so that's one of the things that we're fighting for. And I bring this up also because in 1988, this person, whose name we don't know, 480, managed a victory, a pretty tremendous victory for that family. And then 16 years later, that same thing did not work. So we got to reject the progress narrative. We got to reject the idea that things are always only going to get better. And I'm sorry to say this, but we do. We have to be prepared for backlash and for the courts changing their mind and for finding all sorts of ways to protect trans people, no matter what the political mood is of the day. Okay? And that's about being creative, and that's what we can learn from people who've done work for marginalized people for hundreds of years. We have family law. Family law has told us quite clearly, actually, since 1995, and it's continued to be recognized, that just because a parent is trans, it should not impact their custody and access of their kid. It should not be a relevant factor in and of itself that the parent is trans. But we know, we have data that shows that many trans people are separated from their children. And we have data that we know that best interests of the child can be interpreted with a lot of discretion. Okay? So this is an example that's outside of human rights and that's happening on a daily basis in courts, where this idea of best interests of the child is the idea that when you make decisions about custody and access and other issues in family law, you should always think, put the kid first. We believe in that. Put the kid first, right? But, and perhaps you know this if you've ever had conflict with your children or with your parents, but the definition of the best interest of the child can change depending on who you're talking to. And so this is an example of how lawyers and advocates need to be prepared to marshal the evidence and to show very clearly what we mean by best interest of the child. Okay? And that may be that we have some cases that show that okay, it's not a problem that they're trans, but they talked way too much about their transition to their kids. They should never have exposed the kid to information about their transition, which those of you who may have kids might know it's very hard to keep a lot of things from your kids, particularly transitioning in the home, okay? So we have to be ready to use, and this is a fundamental aspect of family law throughout Canada. We have to be prepared to use these tools. I'll tell you this other one. So in Ontario, this KIB, this trans youth, I had to leave home, and she was living in a co-op housing for I think youth who had to leave home or who needed some additional support. She was a minor, and she wanted to change her name. And we know, we have the studies that show us how many trans youth face homelessness, have separation from their families. And she went and she was doing great, I believe was in school, but really needed to change her name in order to fully live her life. And she wasn't able to under the law because she needed consent from someone who had lawful custody of her. Okay. And so this clinic helped her and represented her and showed that argued that her mother didn't actually have something called lawful custody because the mom wasn't making decisions about her health, wasn't making decisions in her best interest, and it wasn't actually in her daily life. And she got her name changed, not in human rights law, by using another tool outside of human rights to make the change happen, actually under what I won't bore you with, but the very boring definition of what lawful custody is. Not from gender identity or gender expression being added to a human rights code. Maybe societal change had an impact. Maybe the idea of human rights has spread, but this particular lawyer who represented this person and this trans person, they had to be creative to find a way to make their lives better. And arguably, this person was left out by law reform, right? I don't know how trans youth who don't have good relationships with their parents are supposed to get their consent to change their names. And I like this case a lot. This is a youth protection case, okay? A kid who was really not doing well, a trans youth, was getting suicidal, was really having trouble. Youth protection got involved. The parents were completely not supportive. Youth protection is like family services, okay? Family services, youth and family services said, like, this kid's in trouble, we better get in there. And so they made an order, an interim order, where they said, like, you got to give this kid access to psychologists and mental health people who know about trans stuff. And so the youth got access to care. And then things got better, and the mom and the youth started to get along again, and I think the youth returned home. And then the court ordered and said, like, listen, for as long as this kid wants to see trans healthcare people, he should be able to. And also, like, if he doesn't want to, that's fine. But as long as he does, he should be able to. So the court ordered this access to care. And the court also said, at Thanksgiving, you got to make sure that the extended family does not say bad things about the kid. Whether you were going to drag the family members into court after and say, you did not respect that court order it's a question. But I think it's an interesting idea when you start thinking about the symbolic value that that has for that family to say, okay, we're going to get out, we're going to pull court supervision out, but you need to make sure that this youth is protected. Okay? Non-human rights. And then I want to talk about social benefits. Social benefits is access to what we call disability benefits. Okay? And we see from the trans needs legal assessment that access to disability benefits is a big issue for trans people. And what's going on here, and it's a bit difficult to talk about, but we know that trans people face a lot of societal discrimination. We have data that says that in Ontario the median income for trans people is quite low. And we know that that's in part because of discrimination they face in the workplace. Okay? And we see this in the data that was just reported in 2018. Disability benefits, 16% legal issues versus 2%. Discrimination, 43% versus 5.3%. That's the impact of daily discrimination. So I saw, and I was surprised to see when I was looking at all the case law in Canada, that there are many, many social benefit cases that deal with trans people being denied access to disability benefits. And there's an emerging line of case law that says very clearly, trans itself is not a disability, but the impact of systemic discrimination on people in their daily lives can definitely be documented. Okay? And we see this in all marginalized people, right? If you go out and you're facing stigma and discrimination, it's going to have an impact on your physical and mental health. And so what's emerged is that these poverty law clinics are doing work with trans people to make sure that it's well documented. So this person, unfortunately, did not have enough documentation, but being trans is not in and of itself a disability. But this next person here, also in 2014, did. They had a bunch of documentation that showed the mental health impact of stigma in society, and that they needed some support during their period of time where they were transitioning. They were waiting to access hormones, and there were really long waiting lists. And this is one of the only cases we have that very nicely cites the long waiting times to access hormones and surgeries. And so in the void of a lack of health and social services, adequate health and social services, we see people seeking access to disability benefits because of the impact of discrimination they face. That is an intersectional approach to trans rights. That's us looking and seeing what does the case law tell us? Whoa, there's a lot of cases about trans people trying to get access to disability benefits while they're waiting for their lives to improve or access to care. We see trans people self-reporting that discrimination is the biggest challenge that they face, and employment and disability benefits is related. And so we say trans rights includes access to benefits while, pardon me, but it's late and it's been a long day, while society sucks for a lot of trans people. Okay? Some states support figuring out how to access it when we have documentation of the impact of discrimination, which we know is only compounded if you face other intersectional issues. Okay? And immigration law is what I'll do last. Immigration law, interesting trans issues coming up. Again, not in human rights. This person did not tell Canadian immigration authorities that she had changed her sex and name before she came to Canada. And she got in trouble for what's called misrepresentation and faced being thrown out of the country. Okay? And she won the right to stay in Canada by showing clearly that there wasn't a link between why she didn't disclose and immigration-related concerns. It was about her gender identity. Okay? But these are the types of issues that we're starting to see pop up that are informed by human rights. Human rights adjacent, I call them. Okay? You use a lot of human rights data to make an argument that this person, who has no idea how Canadian authorities would respond to the fact that she had previously changed her name and gender when arriving in Canada and did not disclose that information. We have human rights data that tells us and that can support a case for preventing removal. Okay? Ms. Victorious, again, outside of human rights. And this one I like as well. There's a lot of cases. You know. My partner was like, "Why did you do this?" I wanted us to have a holiday. Okay. This one happened in 2013. And this is a gay trans man from South Korea who asked to be recognized as a refugee in Canada. And one of the reasons that he was accepted as a refugee was because in South Korea, he would have been required to have essentially sterilization of his reproductive organs in order to change his sex legally. And they said that is a human rights violation. So for that, that's one of the main reasons we will grant you refugee protection, because of the persecution that you face. Now what's interesting about this case is it's in 2013, which is only 1 year after Ontario changed its rules about sterilization. And so I also call it human rights adjacent. This is the impact of, and this is why I say we don't have to just dismiss human rights, they have very important impact.